In Guatemala, the conflict between indigenous organizations and the national government over mining exploitation continues. Saturday sees the second day of the Tribunal Spirit of Mandela in New York City, a way to denounce U.S. atrocities against Black, brown, and indigenous people. Palestine residents reject Israel's plan to build more than 3,000 settlement homes in the occupied West Bank next week, according to a weekly schedule published by the Civil Administration's Planning Committee. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your host, Gladys Quesada, and these are the news. In Guatemala, the conflict between indigenous organizations and the national government over mining exploitation continues. It is expected that the parties will form work tables to de-escalate the tensions. The government authorities are seeking to establish a dialogue with the indigenous movements that maintain the sit-ins so that it can be lifted and a dialogue can begin. The native peoples are demanding respect for the use and exploitation of their lands and the guarantee of their rights, as well as those of the foreign companies that profit from mining extraction within the government's permission. The demonstrators denounce there are infiltrated groups among them to cause violence, hence justify the militarization and a possible stage of siege. Since October, the authorities of the 4 councils of ancestral Maya Kekchi authorities installed a planton to demand their inclusion in the process of pre-consultation of the mining project Phoenix of the Guatemaltec company of nickel. And the United Nations Children's Fund warns that the number of children and women abducted in Haiti until the end of August has already surpassed last year's total. According to UNICEF Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, Jean Govt, there is no safe place for children in the nation anymore. The officials said the children are being kidnapped on their way to school, at home, or even at church, at any time of the day or night. The UN organization estimated, based on official sources, that 71 women and 30 children were abducted in the first 8 months of this year, up from 59 women and 37 children last year. Most of the kidnappings are taking place in the capital city of Port-au-Prince, and most abductees are Haitian. The situation is worsened by gun violence in the area, which since June has displaced at least 19,000 people and has affected 1.5 million. In Chile, 7 presidential candidates began their televised campaigns this week to attract voters undecided and convince the public of their proposals. As of this Friday until November 18th, candidates to La Moneda Palace will have approximately 3 minutes a day in the open broadcasting channels to announce their proposals. Opinion polls showed about half of voters are undecided, and the highest rate in decades, so candidates will have to direct their messages to this sector in order to convince them with their platforms. On November 21st, some 14.7 million Chileans will be eligible to vote for Sebastián Piñera's replacement, as well as 155 lawmakers in the Chamber of Deputies, or the lower house, and half of the Senate. If no candidates receives a majority, the top 2 will face each other in a December 19th runoff. And the 6th National Brigade for the Search for Disappeared Persons in Mexico confirmed that human remains were found in several unmarked graves in the state of Morelos, south of Mexico City. The brigade, made up of around 160 members of family collectives, explained that among the located remains, 8 were found in the municipality of Yecapixtla after an extensive search operation through excavations. So they still ponder the possibility of it being a mass grave, taking into account the perimeter of approximately 800 meters, which was traveled by the relatives of the missing victims. Up to now, 10 unmarked burial sites have been found by the brigade after it visited 13 municipalities since October 9th. In Mexico also, Tropical Storm Rake evolved into a Category 1 hurricane and is expected to cause waves of 2 to 4 meters high on the coast of Guerrero and Michoacán. The phenomenon is located 330 kilometers southwest of Acapulco in Guerrero and reaches winds of between 119 and 153 kilometers per hour, with possible impact between the coast of Colima and Michoacán. These states will be the most affected by the system, which shows a capacity to produce damage in a radius of 600 kilometers from its core. According to the National Meteorological Service, it has maximum sustained winds of 120 kilometers per hour, gusts of 140 kilometers per hour, and moves toward the north-northwest at a speed of 9 kilometers per hour. Now we address other topics. Over 700,000 doses of the second component of the Sputnik V vaccine arrived in Venezuela this Saturday to continue immunizing the population. The Russian Direct Investment Fund said vaccine deliveries to Latin America were expedited in the last few weeks after several delays in the supplies. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro Moros said the latest batch allows for the start of the immunization campaign for children over 12 years old. According to the high-level Intergovernmental Commission, some 3,860,000 doses of Sputnik V have been supplied by Russia to Venezuela. In Russia, health authorities confirmed over 37,000 new cases of coronavirus infection yesterday. The figure represents a new historical maximum since the beginning of the pandemic. The Slavic nation has been renewing its infection records, with Moscow and St. Petersburg as the most affected cities. In addition to the number of infections, 1,075 citizens died of the virus during the previous day. Russian scientists have developed the vaccines Epivac Corona N, Sputnik V, and Sputnik Light, and also Covivac, with which more than 47 million citizens have been vaccinated. After the latest report, the number of coronavirus carriers in the country has reached over 8,200,000 people. Cuba and Venezuela bolstered their brotherhood ties through health cooperation in the midst of the pandemic. Before a short break, let's watch a clip that illustrates this. Welcome back to From the South. The second day of the International Tribunal on the U.S. human rights violations, called Spirit of Mandela, is taking place in New York City. Spirit of Mandela is a campaign to bring international attention to the U.S. violations of the human rights of U.S.-held political prisoners, as well as U.S. systemic oppression and repression of Black, brown, and indigenous people. The tribunal builds on the revolutionary legacy of W.E. Du Bois, William Patterson, and Paul Robeson for bringing very similar charges against the United States before the United Nations in 1951. The ideological vision of this tribunal has been led by Jalil Mutakim, who spent nearly 50 years in prison, founded the Jericho movement with Safiya Bukhari while in prison and was paroled a year ago, and Jihad Abdulumnit, president of the Jericho movement today. Both were in the Black Panther Party and its armed struggle branch, the Black Liberation Army.
In 1903, upon the launch of his seminal treatise, The Souls of Black Folk, historian W.E.B. Du Bois prophesied that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line, referring to the pernicious role of race in U.S. society. And now, more than 100 years later, his prognosis is even more ominous, as the evidence from this tribunal will show that conditions facing Black, brown, and indigenous peoples residing in the United States during the 21st century amount.
One of the topics discussed on Saturday's tribunal was police violence. Civic leader and professor Malina Abdullah talked about the systematic killing of Black people in the United States.
The targeting, the violent targeting of Black people by police is the way the institution was set up. So the system of policing in this country descends from the system of slave catching. It descends from chattel slavery. It was meant intentionally to put targets on the backs of Black people. And so this is not, the killings of our people at the hands of police are not isolated incidents. They are systemic, and they are the intent of the system. They are not a failure of the system.
This Saturday in the United Kingdom, a new popular demonstration marched to the High Court of London to reject the eventual extradition of WikiLeaks creator Julian Assange to the United States. The activist is currently confined in the Belmarsh High Security Prison, awaiting a hearing that will define his eventual extradition to the United States, where he could serve a sentence of 175 years in prison for disseminating information that demonstrates the illegal practices of the United States. Protesters point out that Assange, 49 years old, has spent most of the last decade in detention or as a refugee, and its health has deteriorated as a result of these proceedings.
If Julian Assange is getting information from whistleblowers, if he is showing the world what's really going on and exposing our corrupt politicians, he should not be put in jail for that. That's what the media is supposed to be doing, and they're not.
If he gets extradited, he's a symbol, and if they extradite him, that is their stamp on the legal system saying, yes, we can extradite anyone who speaks the truth that we don't like anywhere around the world.
We move on to other topics. Military exercises of the Collective Security Treaty Organization take place in Tajikistan. The military exercise, Combat Fraternity 2021, takes place this Saturday in Tajikistan, 20 kilometers away from the border with Afghanistan. 4,000 troops and more than 500 military teams from Russia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan are participating in the exercise, as well as an operation groups from Armenia, all members of the organization founded in 2002. The Russian Central Military District announced that the troops are practicing scenarios of confrontation and elimination of terrorist groups to ensure security and stability in the Central Asian region. Palestine residents rejected Israel's plan to build more than 3,000 settlement homes in the occupied West Bank next week, according to a weekly schedule published by the Civil Administration's Planning Committee. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Stayeh denounced the plans, saying that the biggest challenge facing the Palestinian environment is settlement and its demands. The diplomat also said that Israel continues to control his country's natural resources and prevents access to Palestinian lands behind the wall, using them as a dumping ground for solid, chemical, and electronic waste. It will be the first time the settlement units are approved during the administration of United States President Joe Biden and the current Israeli cabinet. The plan was initially due to go up for approval 2 months ago, but it was stalled by the civil administration. At least 2 police officers and 2 demonstrators were killed in Lahore, Pakistan, where a protest staged by hardline Islamists turned violent. The violence happened after thousands of members of the far-right TLP party launched their long march from the city towards the capital Islamabad, demanding the government release their leader, Saad Rizvi, from prison. Rizvi was charged under anti-terrorism laws following violent protests that erupted in Pakistan last year, after caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad were published in France. Police and paramilitary personnel were deployed to prevent the demonstrators from leaving Lahore, as authorities also suspended mobile phone service and blocked roads. TLP has a long history of elaborate protests and sit-ins to try and get successive governments to give in to their demands.
Our demand is that, first of all, the government expel the French ambassador and release Saad Rizvi, and we don't accept these bullying tactics by Imran Khan.
In Yemen, the regular army, together with the popular committees, recovered the strategic region of Najah in the province of Marib after heavy confrontations against forces sponsored by Saudi Arabia. According to local media, the army, together with the popular Ansar al-Rah movement, took control of the town and besieged the district of Jabal Murad, preparing to start negotiations with local tribal leaders for the liberation of the area. Following the fighting, dozens of militants from the Islah party, which occupies Marib and is linked to Al-Qaeda insurgent group, have fled the area to neighboring provinces as the Yemeni forces gain ground. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. Now we present a brief summary on this week's main stories.
This week, Latin American countries saw several demonstrations against economic inequality, the pandemic mismanagement, and social instability in the region.
In Chile, people took to the streets to mark 2 years of the social outburst of late 2019. Protesters called for justice for the victims of state repression, the release of political prisoners, and the resignation of President Piñera over his role in the repression, and the recent revelations contained in the Pandora Papers investigation.
Also, a nationwide general strike entered the street of Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, with organizers denouncing the rapidly worsening security situation. The Haitian protests gained control over Port-au-Prince and irregular kidnappings. This week, 17 Christian missionaries were kidnapped for ransom, the second such incident in the Caribbean nation.
This week, Ecuador saw protests of agricultural workers against high fuel prices imposed by the government and other economic measures that affect the sector. Given the situation, Ecuador President Guillermo Lasso announced a 60-day state of emergency, which allowed the army to patrol the streets throughout the country. Ecuador's people also reject his involvement in the Pandora Papers scandal.
In Guatemala, tensions mounted as former military members stormed the country's facilities to demand the government to comply with the promised sole compensation of about $15,000 for their participation in the armed conflict from 1960 to 1996. Anti-riot police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the demonstrators.
In Bolivia, social movements and human rights defenders carried a 200-kilometer march from the town of Caracollo to La Paz to demand the legal proceedings advance for the conviction of former de facto presidents Yanin Áñez and the other figures responsible for the acts of violence perpetrated in 2019 in the context of the coup against the government of Evo Morales.
Union and civil society groups protested in Panama City against the questioned reform of the Electoral Code, as the country's president, Laurentino Cortizo, has only vetoed an article of the legislative project. Over 4,000 people participated in the mobilizations, demanding the inclusion of articles in favor of gender parity, allocation of seats, financing of political parties, nor the criminal electoral jurisdiction.
Other topics were prominent in our news brief this week. Venezuela's government announced the kidnapping of diplomatic Al Saab by the U.S. government with the complicity of Cape Verde authorities. Given the situation, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro qualified SAP's kidnapping as inhuman and unfair.
The Venezuelan people rejected Alex Saab kidnapping and demonstrated to support his cause. Saab's wife, Camila Fabri Saab, offered an exclusive interview for TeleSUR, explaining the emotional toll of this incident for the Saab Fabri family and how Cape Verdean authorities violated due process in her husband's detention.
These other events were trending in our informative agenda. Barbados Parliament laid down one of the final steps to the Caribbean nation becoming a republic on electing its first president, putting an end to the colonial vestige of the British head of state. In a special joint session of Parliament, the House of Assembly, as a collective, voted on the election of Governor-General Madame Sandra Mason, who will become the island's first president on November 30th, Independence Day, and the date of which Barbados becomes a republic.
We move on to other topics. Colombia and Venezuela saw steps up and setbacks in their bilateral relations. The President of the National Assembly of Venezuela, Jorge Rodriguez, announced on Wednesday that he received a proposal approved by the Senate of Colombia for the normalization of diplomatic and trade relations between the two countries.
Soon after this announcement, Colombian President Iván Duque denied all possibility of resuming diplomatic relations with the Venezuelan government during a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, rejecting all efforts made by the Colombian Senate on this matter.
These were the main pieces of information that trend on our agenda this week. For more updates, analysis, and details, stay tuned to TeleSUR English on YouTube or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And like this, we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media for all the latest news. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.